Remember when Christopher shot a bakery worker in the foot over a pastry? Or when he relapsed into heroin addiction while trying to write a movie script about his own criminal life? These aren't just impulsive mob guy moments. They are the desperate, self-destructive actions of a man whose very soul is fractured by intergenerational trauma, a legacy he never chose but from which he cannot escape. What if Christopher Moltisanti isn't just Tony's volatile nephew? What if he's the most tragic character in The Sopranos? A walking case study in how the psychological inheritance of a toxic family system destroys lives before they even begin? In HBO's iconic series, The Sopranos, Christopher represents the devastating psychology of transgenerational haunting. Someone born into a world where his fate was decided before his first breath. Behind his artistic dreams and violent outbursts lies a man whose entire identity was constructed around living up to a dead father's legacy, creating a psychological prison that makes freedom impossible and self-destruction inevitable. The neuroscience of inherited identity. Christopher's psychology reveals the devastating effects of inherited identity disorder. When a child's sense of self becomes entirely built around living up to a deceased parent's legacy, his brain never developed an authentic identity because from birth, he was told exactly who he was supposed to become. Dickie Moltisanti's son, future made man, Tony's heir apparent. This isn't just family pressure, it's neurological programming. When children are consistently told they must fulfill a specific destiny, their developing brains literally sculpt themselves around that external identity, leveraging neuroplasticity to prioritize the performance of an inherited role rather than the discovery of an authentic self. Christopher's artistic aspirations aren't separate from his criminal identity. They're desperate attempts by his psyche to create some space for authentic self-expression within the suffocating constraints of inherited expectation. Notice how Christopher talks about his father Dickie, whom he barely knew. He doesn't have real memories. He has mythologized narratives that others constructed for him. What family systems theorists call a family script or family myth. A collective, often idealized narrative that dictates roles and identities within a family, particularly in dysfunctional systems. His entire sense of masculinity, purpose, and worth is built on living up to a ghost, creating an impossible psychological burden where he can never truly succeed because he's competing with an idealized dead man. The psychological accuracy is chilling. Real inherited trauma often manifests exactly like this. Children who develop false selves entirely constructed around family expectations, leaving their authentic identity buried so deep they don't even know it exists. The addiction as chemical dissociation from inherited pain. Christopher's heroin addiction isn't just weakness or poor impulse control. It's chemical dissociation from an identity that was never truly his. When someone's entire sense of self is built around external expectations rather than internal authenticity, the psychological pain becomes unbearable. Drugs provide temporary escape from the exhausting performance of being someone else, offering a chemical pathway to psychological dissociation from an identity that was never truly his. In Season 4, when Christopher relapses while writing his screenplay, watch the psychological pattern. He's attempting to create something authentic, his own artistic vision. But the moment it conflicts with his criminal obligations, the internal tension becomes so overwhelming that he needs chemical relief. His addiction isn't separate from his identity crisis. It's a symptom of psychological fragmentation. His relationship with drugs follows the classic pattern of inherited trauma response. Children who grow up carrying the weight of family legacy often develop addictive behaviors as the only way to temporarily silence the internal voices demanding they be someone they're not. Christopher's highs aren't just about pleasure. They're about brief, desperate moments of authentic selfhood when the inherited expectations temporarily quiet, allowing a glimpse of the real Christopher to breathe. The most tragic aspect is how his addiction becomes another way he disappoints the family legacy. His drug use isn't rebellion against his inherited identity. It's proof of his failure to live up to it, creating a shame spiral that drives him deeper into chemical escape. The addiction, while destructive, paradoxically offers him fleeting moments of freedom from the crushing weight of his inherited identity, a perverse form of self-medication for existential pain. The psychology of surrogate fatherhood and disorganized attachment. Christopher's relationship with Tony reveals the devastating psychology of surrogate parenthood in trauma families. Tony isn't just his boss or uncle. He's the father figure Christopher never had, which creates an impossible psychological dynamic where love, approval, and survival become hopelessly entangled through disorganized attachment, a pattern where the caregiver is simultaneously a source of comfort and fear. Watch how Christopher seeks Tony's approval in Season 1. His body language, his desperate need for recognition, his willingness to endure humiliation for brief moments of paternal acknowledgement. These aren't professional relationships. They're attachment trauma playing out in real time. Christopher literally cannot separate his need for Tony's love from his need for Tony's professional approval. This surrogate father relationship becomes profoundly enmeshed and psychologically toxic because Tony simultaneously represents salvation and destruction. Christopher needs Tony's approval to feel worthy of his inherited legacy, but earning that approval requires behaviors that destroy his authentic self. He's trapped in a psychological double-bind where love equals self-destruction. The most disturbing aspect is how Tony unconsciously transmits the same traumatic patterns that shaped his own development, perpetuating the cycle while genuinely believing he's providing love and guidance. Tony's treatment of Christopher, the mixture of affection and cruelty, protection and exploitation, mirrors how damaged parents unconsciously pass trauma to the next generation through enmeshment, a lack of clear boundaries where their identities and emotional states are intertwined in an unhealthy way. The creative dreams as failed sublimation. Christopher's screenwriting aspirations aren't just artistic hobbies. They're unconscious rebellion against his inherited identity and a genuine, albeit ultimately thwarted attempt at psychological sublimation and integration. His desire to write movies about mob life represents his psyche's desperate attempt to transform his traumatic reality into something he can control and reshape. A sublimation technique where unacceptable impulses or painful experiences are transformed into socially acceptable forms. In Season 2, when Christopher talks about his screenplay You Bark, I Bite, notice the psychological significance. He's trying to take his lived trauma and transform it into art, which is a classic psychological integration technique and represents a healthy impulse toward healing. Through creative expression, trauma survivors attempt to process experiences that were too overwhelming to integrate normally. But his creative dreams also reveal the psychological barriers that inherited trauma creates around authentic self-expression. Even his rebellion takes the form of glorifying the very system that's destroying him. He can't imagine stories outside the criminal world because his identity is so completely constructed around that reality. His artistic vision is still psychologically colonized by the family legacy he's trying to escape. The tragedy is that his creative abilities are genuine. He has real artistic talent that could provide authentic self-expression. But his inherited identity makes it impossible to pursue art without it somehow serving the family system. His creative work becomes sanitized trauma that's been edited to maintain family loyalty, preventing true artistic authenticity. The violence as compulsive identity maintenance. Christopher's explosive violence isn't just criminal behavior. It's identity performance anxiety made manifest, connected to a deeply fragile ego that requires constant external validation. When someone's entire sense of self is built around inherited expectations rather than authentic development, any threat to that performance triggers existential terror that gets expressed through rage. In Season 1, Episode 8, when Christopher shoots the bakery worker, watch the psychological pattern. The violence isn't about the money or even respect. It's about shoring up a crumbling self-concept that is entirely dependent on external validation of his mob guy persona. His rage comes from the terror that he might not be living up to his inherited identity, that he might be failing to honor his father's memory. His violence follows the classic pattern of performance anxiety aggression. When someone feels they must constantly prove they deserve their inherited position, any perceived challenge becomes a test of their fundamental worthiness. Christopher's outbursts aren't about the immediate situation. They're about defending his right to exist within the family legacy. The most psychologically disturbing aspect is how his violence becomes compulsive identity maintenance, a ritual, a desperate, almost involuntary act to prove he belongs, to prove he is man enough for the inherited role. He doesn't choose to be violent. He feels compelled to prove his violent capabilities because violence is central to the inherited identity he must perform. The loyalty trap of invisible loyalties. Christopher's loyalty to the family isn't based on choice or values. It's inherited obligation that he experiences as psychological compulsion, what family systems theorists call invisible loyalties, or familial loyalty binds. Unconscious, unbreakable obligations to the family system that operate at the cost of individual well-being. This creates a horrifying psychological trap where loyalty becomes a form of self-imprisonment. Christopher's devotion to Tony and the family isn't love. It's the desperate clinging of someone whose entire sense of self depends on maintaining his position within the inherited system. He literally cannot conceive of betraying the family because betrayal would mean destroying the only identity he's ever known. His loyalty becomes pathological because it's not based on mutual respect or shared values, but on existential dependency. Christopher needs the family's validation to feel he has the right to exist, which makes him simultaneously invaluable and completely expendable. His inherited position gives him status but no real power or security, demonstrating his complete lack of agency in this loyalty. The psychological irony is devastating. His loyalty to his inherited identity prevents him from ever discovering who he might authentically be. He's so busy being Dickie Moltisanti's son that he never gets to find out who Christopher Moltisanti could have been. The romantic relationships as corrective emotional experiences. Christopher's relationships with women reveal his unconscious attempts to escape inherited trauma through romantic connection. His relationships with Adriana, and later Kelly, represent desperate attempts to create authentic intimacy outside the suffocating family system, with Adriana specifically representing the potential for a corrective emotional experience. A relationship that could offer a different, healthier attachment model than his traumatic family bonds. With Adriana, watch the psychological pattern in Season 4 and 5. She represents the possibility of a life outside the inherited criminal identity. Someone who loves him for who he is, rather than what family he represents. But his inherited trauma makes authentic intimacy impossible because he doesn't have an authentic self to share. His treatment of Adriana becomes increasingly controlling and violent as their relationship deepens, not because he doesn't love her, but because intimacy threatens to expose the emptiness where his authentic identity should be. He can't allow her to get too close because she might discover that there's no real Christopher underneath the inherited performance. A fear of genuine intimacy linked to the terror that there's no real Christopher beneath the inherited performance. The ultimate betrayal, his role in Adriana's murder, represents the complete victory of inherited identity over authentic love. When forced to choose between his inherited family loyalty and his authentic romantic connection, the inherited programming wins. He literally sacrifices love for legacy, destroying the one relationship that offered escape from his psychological prison. The substance abuse as identity dissolution. Christopher's relationship with drugs and alcohol reveals the psychological function of chemical dissociation in inherited trauma. His substance abuse isn't just addiction. It's his psyche's attempt to temporarily dissolve the overwhelming burden of inherited identity, offering chemical escape from the burden of the false self. In Season 6, when Christopher's drinking escalates, notice how it correlates with increased pressure to live up to family expectations. The more he's forced to perform his inherited identity, the more he needs chemical relief from the psychological strain. His substances aren't recreational. They're medicinal, treating the chronic pain of living as someone else, a desperate form of self-medication for chronic psychological pain. His addiction creates a vicious cycle where chemical escape becomes another form of inherited failure. His family sees his substance abuse as weakness and disappointment, which increases his shame about failing to live up to his inherited legacy, which drives him deeper into chemical escape. He's trapped in a psychological spiral where his coping mechanism becomes another source of inherited trauma. The most tragic aspect is how his addiction prevents the very escape it promises. Instead of freeing him from inherited identity, his substance abuse becomes another way he disappoints the family legacy, reinforcing his sense of unworthiness and driving him deeper into the inherited trauma cycle. The mentorship paradox and trauma transmission. Christopher's role as mentor to younger criminals like Matthew Bevilacqua and Sean Gismonte reveals how inherited trauma perpetuates itself across generations through unconscious transmission. His attempts to guide younger men follow the same traumatic patterns that shaped his own development, creating new victims while he remains unconscious of the cycle. Watch how Christopher treats his protégés in Season 2. He simultaneously wants to protect them from the trauma he experienced, while unconsciously recreating the same psychological dynamics that damaged him. He can't teach what he never learned: how to develop authentic identity outside the criminal family system. His mentorship becomes trauma transmission disguised as guidance. He passes on the same inherited expectations, the same identity confusion, the same psychological imprisonment that destroyed his own authentic development. He genuinely believes he's helping them, just as Tony believed he was helping Christopher, highlighting the insidious nature of intergenerational trauma. The psychological tragedy is that Christopher's attempts to be a better mentor than Tony was to him still operate within the same inherited trauma framework. He can only teach what he knows, which is the system that damaged him, demonstrating how the cycle perpetuates unconsciously across generations. The creative sublimation failure and psychological barriers. Christopher's attempts to channel his trauma into creative expression reveal the profound psychological barriers that inherited trauma creates around authentic self-expression. His screenwriting represents his unconscious attempt to transform his lived experience into art, but his inherited identity makes authentic creative expression impossible. In Season 4, when Christopher works on his screenplay, watch the psychological conflict. He wants to tell authentic stories about his experience, but his inherited identity won't allow him to be truly honest about the psychological cost of criminal life. The internalized fear of retribution, the mob's code of silence, and the profound shame associated with revealing the truth of their lives create insurmountable barriers to authentic artistic expression. His creative dreams also reveal the psychological split between his authentic artistic self and his inherited criminal identity. He has genuine creative talent and vision, but expressing it fully would require acknowledging truths about his family and himself that his inherited programming won't allow. The failure of his creative sublimation represents the complete victory of inherited trauma over authentic self-expression. He literally cannot create authentic art, because doing so would require accessing an authentic self that inherited trauma buried so deep it's essentially inaccessible. His artistic vision becomes sanitized trauma that serves the family system rather than challenging it. The death drive of inherited trauma. Christopher's increasingly reckless behavior in later seasons reveals what psychologists call inherited death drive, the unconscious compulsion toward self-destruction that develops when inherited trauma makes authentic life impossible. His escalating violence, his return to substance abuse, his increasingly erratic behavior. These aren't just poor choices, they're unconscious suicide attempts. When someone's entire identity is built around inherited expectations that make authentic selfhood impossible, the psyche sometimes chooses destruction over continued psychological imprisonment. In Season 6, Christopher's behavior becomes increasingly self-sabotaging in ways that seem almost intentional. He's unconsciously creating situations that will lead to his destruction, because some part of his psyche recognizes that death is preferable to continued existence as someone else's inherited identity. His death drive isn't conscious suicidal ideation. It's the unconscious recognition that his inherited identity has made authentic life impossible. It's not deliberate conscious acts, but rather the psyche's desperate, unconscious attempts to exit an intolerable psychological prison. His psyche chooses destruction over continued psychological imprisonment, even though he's not consciously aware of making that choice. The generational trauma cycle and systemic perpetuation. Christopher's story reveals how inherited trauma perpetuates itself across generations through family systems that mistake trauma transmission for love and guidance. His relationship with his own son represents the potential continuation of the same cycle that destroyed his own authentic development. Watch how Christopher talks about his future child in Season 6. He genuinely wants to be a better father than the figures who raised him. But he has no model for healthy fatherhood because his own development was so completely shaped by inherited trauma. He can only imagine parenting within the same criminal family framework that damaged him. His death before his child grows up might actually be psychologically protective. It prevents him from unconsciously transmitting the same inherited trauma patterns to the next generation. His absence might allow his child to develop authentic identity in ways that Christopher's presence would have made impossible. The generational trauma cycle reveals the systemic nature of inherited trauma. It's not just individual psychological damage, but Soprano family system dysfunction that creates damaged individuals who then damage the next generation while believing they're providing love and guidance. This is not just about Christopher, but about the self-perpetuating cycle of damage within the entire family system. The impossible integration. Christopher's psychological journey represents the near impossibility of integrating authentic self with inherited identity, when the inheritance is fundamentally toxic. His attempts to be both authentic artist and inherited criminal create psychological splits that ultimately prove irreconcilable. His story suggests that some forms of inherited trauma are so complete, so totalizing, that authentic recovery may be impossible within the family system that created the trauma. Christopher can't become his authentic self while remaining loyal to his inherited identity, because the two are fundamentally incompatible. The tragedy is that glimpses of his authentic self, his artistic vision, his capacity for love, his moments of genuine insight, prove that there was a real person underneath the inherited performance. But the inherited trauma was so complete that accessing that authentic self would have required destroying everything he believed about himself and his family. For some, true healing or self-discovery requires a complete break from the source of trauma, which Christopher was unable to achieve. The ultimate sacrifice to inherited identity. Christopher's final fate represents the complete victory of inherited trauma over authentic selfhood. His death isn't just the result of poor choices or criminal lifestyle. It's the inevitable outcome of a psychological system that made authentic life impossible. His relationship with Tony ultimately reveals the murderous nature of inherited trauma systems. Tony's decision to kill Christopher isn't just about immediate circumstances. It's the logical conclusion of a relationship built on inherited trauma rather than authentic love. The surrogate father destroys the inherited son when the son's authentic self threatens the inherited system. It's not just a criminal organization. It's a psychological entity that devours its own, eliminating threats to its own perpetuation. Christopher Moltisanti represents the ultimate tragedy of intergenerational trauma. A man whose authentic self was murdered before it could fully develop, leaving only the inherited performance of someone else's identity. His story forces us to confront the devastating reality that some family legacies are so toxic that inheriting them means sacrificing any possibility of authentic selfhood. The most disturbing aspect isn't his violence or his addiction. It's the recognition that Christopher never got the chance to discover who he really was underneath the inherited expectations. Every perfectly executed criminal act, every moment of family loyalty, every attempt to live up to his father's legacy was simultaneously an act of self-destruction. His artistic dreams weren't separate from his criminal identity. They were desperate attempts by his authentic self to survive within a psychological system designed to destroy individual authenticity in favor of inherited performance. His creativity represented the last refuge of his genuine identity, which is why it ultimately had to be sacrificed to maintain family loyalty. Christopher's story reminds us that behind every family legacy may be a system of inherited trauma that destroys individual authenticity while disguising itself as love, tradition, and guidance. His tragedy isn't just personal, it's systemic, revealing how family systems can become psychological prisons that trap each generation in inherited patterns of trauma and destruction. The most chilling realization is that Christopher's inherited trauma wasn't an accident or aberration. It was the intended outcome of a family system that requires psychological conformity and inherited identity to maintain itself. His authentic self wasn't collateral damage. It was the deliberate sacrifice necessary to perpetuate the inherited trauma system across generations.